Okay, here we are again. Eddie Moore Jr. here, Coffee with the Founder. I got my coffee cup here.
I have mine.
And today we're here with Becki Cohn-Vargas, who is going to be sharing some of her knowledge with us. Becki, what we're trying to do with this is just really introduce people to people who are connected to myself or the conference and the work that they're doing day to day, every day. A lot of times people see folks at conferences or see people in publication, but they don't really get a chance to get a sense of who that person is. So that's what we're trying to do with these coffee conversations. So let's say I meet you at the subway stop or the grocery store. We introduce ourselves and I say, well, who are you? What do you do? What's your work? What's your expertise? What's your research? How would you respond to that?
I think of myself as a person who's had a lifelong commitment to equity and social justice. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors, or I would call them Holocaust refugees. They escaped with barely their clothes on their back. My mother was rescued and helped by a family in England, a Quaker family named the Clarks, who owned a shoe company that you probably heard of, Clark Shoes, and they just took her into their home. And then my father ended up in Shanghai as a refugee for his whole, from 11 until 19. He grew up in poverty and trying to make a life. He lost his mother. And so they wanted to make a good life for their children, a comfortable life, a middle-class life in America. They were so grateful to be here. But I wanted to end the kind of bigotry that I saw that happened to them and that I saw growing up here in the US, of course, growing up during the civil rights movement. And I remember I was in middle school when Martin Luther King was killed. And that just gave me this passion to do this kind of work. And so I did it through the field of education. I felt like education was the best venue for social change, plus you're preparing the next generation of leaders. So you're kind of doing it a double whammy. And I became very interested in the work of stereotype threat that Claude Steele was working on, and I was friendly with his wife, Dorothy Steele. The idea of stereotype threat is the idea that a person could be negatively impacted by a stereotype in such a way that it actually lowers their performance. In the case of academics, the research shows that when the negative stereotypes are triggered, a person will, even if they don't believe it's true, will fear that others might, and it impacts their schooling. And that's particularly true for African American and Latino students. They've done the research at all grade levels. It's also true for women in the area of mathematics. So what was the solution to deal with that kind of stereotype threat? Dorothy Steele and Claude Steele did a research study in 2000 on what they called the Stanford Integrated Schools Project. And basically they were looking at what could teachers do that would be different in such a way that students would not be impacted by stereotype threat. Kind of like a vaccination, now we're talking about the inoculations against the coronavirus. So what would be an inoculation against the negative stereotypes that prevail in our society? And in that research, they worked with third graders and fifth graders, and they discovered a series of things that teachers do that made a real difference, where the students did better, they liked school more, they felt their teachers cared about them. And that was what created what the Steeles called identity safety, the idea that a student feels that his or her background has value and that they're not doing well in spite of their background, they're doing well because of everything in their identity that helps them be who they are. And so I worked with the Steeles and did my dissertation on this topic, and then eventually wrote a book with Dorothy Steele aimed at elementary educators, identity safe classrooms, places to belong and learn. And along the way, I forgot to mention that I worked as a teacher and a principal and a curriculum developer and a curriculum director and a superintendent. So I really did immerse myself in the trenches. And then since I've written that book, I've mainly been continuing to write and continuing to spread this idea that I believe so deeply, that we need to create identity safety for our students. And it spreads across all kinds of stereotypes and negative attitudes, whether it's about kids who are LGBTQ, whether it's about students with disabilities. It's a very powerful concept that still has not caught fire, although I was really happy to write a chapter in the guide for white women teachers of Black boys, because I was really happy to be part of that really important project. So, and I look forward to seeing your next book. And I am about to release my next book, where I worked with 2 high school educators, and we did basically an identity safe classroom grades 6 through 12 with strategies to do in the secondary classroom. And then I'm also starting to work on a school-wide identity safety book. So hopefully these ideas will get out there and people won't just think identity safety means protecting yourself against identity theft.
Right.
Although I do, and I even wrote this in the second book, it's actually a very good metaphor, because when your identity is stolen, when you can't use your credit cards and you can't function as who you are, you feel pretty bad. But when it happens on an emotional and psychological level, it's much worse, whether your identity is stolen by negative attitudes and stereotypes or by negative treatment. It's something that we need to work to change.
Yeah, some excellent and fascinating work. I mean, from the budding seed of stereotype threat to now this blossoming flower and hopefully oak tree of identity safety that you're continuing and expanding upon. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because I'm wondering if in your research, in your work, in your experience, does the race of the teacher matter in establishing the identity safety of the student being impacted, particularly around issues of race and stereotype threat?
In the second book, we do have a chapter on teacher identity safety, and I do think what matters even more than the race is the teacher's own sense of their identity. The fact of the teacher feeling and getting the power of identity and having a sense of who they are and having explored their identity. And yes, for students, you don't want them to go through a whole school career without seeing people that look like them in front of them in the classroom. I do think that's really important, but I don't think that's a deal breaker. And I think teachers who examine themselves, who understand racism as much as what you can from being in the privileged group of white people, the more you really look at your implicit bias, the more you recognize your privilege, I think that makes a big difference, and the students know it and can feel it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I want to come back to some of that, but you also mentioned some of your experience working with leaders and leadership. And I think one of the things we've been asking people about in this time around COVID-19, one is how you're doing, how your circle of influence, family, friends, community are handling this time. But also, we were just quickly talking before we got on. Can you talk a little bit about the role of leadership during this time? Because I think we're facing some of that from a national standpoint and even from some states to states, regional standpoint, but particularly in education, I think we're seeing teachers and administrators in a very unique position. Some people have opted out to homeschooling and virtual schooling, but now it's like, this is what you need to do. And I'm wondering how you're seeing, and what are you seeing in reference to leaders, leadership, the role of those folks, the challenges? I mean, there must be so much going on right now.
There is, and I think this is a very, very important time for leaders. As my friend Don, who leads a group of administrators, said, you know, this is a time you've been preparing for your whole career. This is a time when it matters more than ever. to step up and be a leader. Now, I'm not in that role. I think of myself, or I like to think of myself as a thought leader now, but I had years as a principal in Oakland where I had to be ready to lock my school down, and I had to lock my school down. So it's a little different, but I do remember the weight, that burden of responsibility. I had 1,000 kids in that building, and I had to keep them safe, and there was gunfire outside, or there was some danger going on, and I had to make decisions very quickly. You have a tremendous responsibility as an educational leader. In the classroom teacher is an educational leader with their students and their parents and the families. The principal is an educational leader with the teachers and the rest of the staff. And then, of course, your district people. And I think what I've seen is a lot of people they were very overwhelmed. And I think one of the first things schools did, which was good, was to figure out how to feed the kids, because there were kids who counted on those meals. But at the same time, I talked to a parent I'm friends with who is undocumented and who doesn't have work right now during this time. And I said, well, are you going to get the food? And she said, well, you have to stand in these long lines and everyone's bunched together and you get this little tiny meal. And then you have to go back at lunchtime. You get the breakfast and the lunch. And so I think then it took a while, and the school started trying to figure out, well, maybe, I think in San Francisco, they're actually giving out larger amounts of food, less times a week to avoid that. So there were tremendous logistic issues that emerged. And so I think the principals at this moment and the district administrators were just scrambling. And it was all over the map from the people I talked to. My niece, who's a teacher, didn't hear from her principal in like 2 weeks. And, you know, she was trying to figure out how to do it. And she had a Zoom meeting with one of her parents, ran it, the Zoom part, because she'd never done it. And then all of a sudden the kids were second graders. They were all talking at once and the parent muted. It sounded like a disaster. The parent muted it and started reading them a story. And she felt like, who am I? Chopped liver, you know, it was, you know, and so I think over the weeks it's steadily improving. But I think it's very important to keep the priorities straight. And the priorities are making sure every family is reached. And I know in some places they're doing an amazing job. School buses are delivering computers and hotspots to homes where they don't have them. I know that there are systems you can create for contacting every family by phone or somehow. But at the same time, this little boy that I've actually been tutoring him every day, the son of my friend, his teacher gave a fat pile of ditto sheets. And the mother, who doesn't speak English, is sitting down with him, and he's a little bit hyper, and it's torture for the two of them. And so schools need to be reaching out to the families and asking them what they need and giving advice on how to work with them. That's what I'm trying to tell her. You know, I'm tutoring him, but I can't do those ditto sheets electronically because I can't see them. And he's not even probably learning much from those sheets. Meanwhile, I'm working on reading and him writing stories. But bottom line is, this is a crucial time for leaders to reach out to all the families, to talk with the staff members and find out what their needs are and how they're feeling, to calm everyone down about the academic progress and make them realize that relationships are more important than progress. Do you want me to answer the other question also about how I'm dealing with the crisis, what I see, or do you have more questions on the leadership?
Yeah, I do have more questions, but I still want to know first, how are you doing? How is your coping, experiencing, dealing with the time we're in?
The time we're in. Well, I have some unique things that make it both easier and harder. One is that I have my first grandchild was born, I think he's 3 weeks now. And my daughter lives in Southern California and I'm in Northern California, and I couldn't be there. I couldn't be with them. I couldn't help her as we had planned. And so that's been really hard. She also had a difficult labor and a difficult birth and a week in the hospital. So that was really hard on my husband and myself. She's on the other side of it. Now her complaints are mainly the typical ones of a new mother, welcome to parenthood. But that's been a hard thing for me. And then one of my other daughters had her whole livelihood stopped because she had a new business as an esthetician. And so she's trying to figure out how she can make it during this time. And then my son was looking for a new job. So I watched all of this somewhat at a distance, wanting to help. And that was a big aha for me, your adult children, well, you've raised them and they'll be okay. They'll take care of it. And it's hard not to be able to be there. The part that was a little bit easier is, I think that I was getting chemotherapy for a while, and actually almost 2 years, year and a half. And so I'm kind of been in quarantine for a while. I have a much slower life, and that has focused me on my writing. And I'm very grateful that I don't feel sick, and that I'm taking a medication that seems to be helping with the cancer. And the way I'm coping is writing blogs, actually. I told you I'm going to be working on a new book, but I've been writing blogs. I write for a group called 60 and Me, which is for people in their 60s, because as you can imagine, being over 65 and having a condition of cancer, I'm probably going to be one of the last people that goes back to quote unquote a normal life. And so I'm sort of situated for the long haul. I wrote a blog on grieving because I lost my father earlier this year, and there's a lot of grief out there. And I've done one on grieving also for educators. This was grieving for the people in their 60s that got a lot of traction. A lot of people talked about losing family members in this time, and it's very frightening. My father died in January, so we were almost grateful that he missed this whole episode. So I'm working on the blog on leadership. I did a blog for teachers on kind of key principles to keep in mind, and a blog for a group where I worked called Not in Our Town, which does work on stopping hate and bigotry and racism. And so I did a blog about sort of guiding principles for when you care about the community. And then I did a blog on virtual volunteer opportunities to give people who are wanting to do something to help others all that writing. And then every day at 4 o'clock, I tutor my 2 kids. They're 2 boys, one's 7, and he's was one of those really smart kids who's struggling with reading. And he's bilingual, but mostly we're working in English. And then his older brother's in high school, and he was also getting work that wasn't that interesting. So we've been working on his autobiography, and I've been helping him write, just improve his writing as he's working on his life story. I said, when you're older, you'll really be happy to see this. And it actually is really fun for me. It gives me something really concrete and able to do. Although with the little 7-year-old, we got on this whole thing about Greek gods, and then he wanted to talk about God. And I thought, oh no, I said, you better talk to your mom about this. But he's really interesting. I've been learning about dinosaurs, aquatic dinosaurs. I never knew about them, and the history of marine biology, because he wants to be a marine biologist. So I just feel like there's so much you can do even when you're stuck at home, maintaining contact, calling seniors that that are home stuck by themselves or in nursing homes. And I think helping others has really kept me positive. Along with my new grandchild, I get to at least see him on Messenger and video calls.
Yeah. You have any thoughts about what challenges may lay ahead after quarantine as it relates to education? In particular, I'm worrying, will we now have more reliance on virtual learning? which may create possibly a greater disparity, a disconnection in reference to teaching and learning. What are some of your thoughts about what may be next after, I mean, at least some people spending months, or at least a couple months, if not 6 months, in this kind of virtual learning requirement?
I think that ultimately these 6 months are going to deepen the divide, and it worries me a lot because there is so much out there in terms of virtual learning for people who have that access and who jump right into it. But I think they said 15,000 kids were absent and missing in Los Angeles School District. So what are those students doing? What's happened to them? I don't think the actual academics will progress very much, even for the ones who do have access. But I do feel that everyone will come out of it with this deeper split, this deeper divide. Could that have a positive impact in terms of lighting a firecracker under people? That's what I would think. People like us, people like what you're, the Privileged Institute, we need to capitalize on this moment to highlight the things that were already there before, that we know about, that we've been talking about, that maybe other people weren't paying attention to. But maybe there will be some people who will now think, hey, wait a minute, I've come to see and realize more about what's been going on at home for some of my kids who haven't had access, who haven't been able to move forward. I'm also worried on a larger scale about poverty and homelessness, and some of the really awful things happen when there's an economic decline. And I think that will exacerbate it. But I also think we need to, again, leaders need to be in the positive rather than wringing our hands and saying, oh no, this is terrible. You know, we don't even know which direction this country is going to go in November with who we're going to elect. Are we going to, wake up? Because we've lost so much during these last 4 years in education. And, will we be able to wake up to that and, turn over a new leaf, or won't we? And I think all we can do is try and really put our energy where it needs to be. For me, in the area of identity safety, I just feel like naming things, really pointing out the disparities, asking educators to really look inside themselves. There should be an onslaught of people wanting to attend your virtual conference once you figure out when, and once you figure out, the whole price point. The one thing about teachers is most of them are getting their salary. They were, even my daughter is an office manager, the one who just had the baby, in Head Start, and they sent all their teachers home at full pay. I don't exactly know what they're expecting of those teachers. So technically, I think you could create a sliding scale, and I would say go for it. I know the AFT did they had a virtual conference plan. They do these webinars on Share My Lesson. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they had a record number of participants. So I think that I would encourage you to just recognize that the serious risk we have going forward of things sliding backward, and then just push ahead. And I do think that there may be more, I don't know, your question about more reliance on online learning, I'm not sure. It could go the other way. People will be so happy to be off Zoom and to be face to face. They may kind of say, okay, we did that, been there, done that. We don't want to do it. There also will be a push, because we already know the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, has, pushed towards privatization, pushed towards, destroying public education. And so we'll have to be aware of where, what little insidious things are happening. But I think for people, especially the constituency you've already been working with, there will be motivation to not go back to business as usual and to learn lessons. And that's, again, the blog we were writing on leadership. We decided we'll save the what lessons learned for a second blog later on, because people aren't quite there yet. But we will need to highlight the lessons we've learned along from this experience.
So in the work around identity safety, did you get a sense, or do you have a sense of about how long it takes to develop that, or possibly reverse that stereotype threat that's in the mind of the young person? Do you have any kind of sense of if it takes the school year, 3 months, any kind of sense about how much time it really needs that you must apply or focus on to be able to really embed this identity safety either within your classroom or within your school building?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know what research has been done on that, but my anecdotal sense is, on one level, it can happen rather quickly if a teacher believes in the student, if the classroom isn't colorblind, isn't reproducing some of the negative stereotypes and helping kids actually build an awareness. I think kids can gain confidence rather quickly. On the other hand, there will be kids who have shut down, and they're, the year, I guess it depends on the years of damage already. I think if a child comes into a school where the identity safety is valued, starting from the beginning, it will make a difference and begin to impact it. And I know that there, oops, I lost my train here. I had an idea. I know Zaretta Hammond has written a lot about, the power of the counter narrative.
Yeah.
And we wrote a lot about it in our book. So you're kind of doing a few things at once. You're doing this counter narrative where they're learning that not everything they see on the outside is actually, they don't have to believe it because it's wrong, and you can show that through learning different views of history. But at the same time, you're also counteracting that learned helplessness and lack of trust that kids have built over time. So you're doing those two things at once, and you're doing it from a positive and not kind of fomenting anger, but fomenting possibility. I think that one teacher could make a tremendous difference in kids' life, but then a combined group of teachers, one building on the other across a student's educational experience, that can really be powerful. So that, I think that's a good topic for research. And I don't know if you know of research on similar types of things, of kids being in classrooms where there's culturally responsive teaching on an ongoing basis, how much that works. I do have a story that I know from a teacher I've worked with who actually was a student and who was in school, and in one classroom she was acting up and acting, just causing all kinds of problems for her teacher, resisting and rebelling. And in another classroom at the exact same time, she wasn't. And it was because that teacher, every day he would greet her and ask her brother had been deported that year, and she was upset, and he was concerned about her, and she acted completely different, and she ended up becoming a teacher. And she tells that story, and she's actually a teacher in the school where she was a student. She said, that just shows it's completely possible when you are treated in a respectful way that honors your identity and who you are, you can understand that and change.
Yeah. I remember engaging Claude's work in my PhD efforts, primarily as it related to testing, ACT, SAT. And I think recently, at least in the last 5 years or so, we're beginning to see people actually point to eugenics and eugenicists as part of playing a role in the creation of these tests.
Mhm.
So I'm just wondering, like, what's your sense? Because I'm assuming people ask you about standardized testing or testing of students and identity safety. So what's some of your thoughts about the role of testing, standardized testing as it relates to identity safety?
Actually, that when we were talking about what was going to happen as a result of the coronavirus, one of the things that's happened is colleges are not using the test, the SAT. They can't because they can't give the test. And we were wondering if that could positively influence the future because those tests are very harmful. And so, yeah, the test reinforces some of those eugenicist attitudes. And the schools in Palo Alto were named after the eugenicists. You know, people don't realize. I once gave a workshop on the history of views of intelligence, and I drew this sort of metaphorical picture of the teacher dipping her into a well, dipping a bucket, and you think you're dipping into this well of clear water, but really the attitudes about eugenics and the attitudes of white supremacy are, the water's tainted right from the get-go. And so how do you begin to even unpack all that? And you know, the bell curve, which teachers may not even have heard of, the younger teachers, was this horrible book written by two extremely racist eugenicists. And one of them died, and the other, Murray, is still alive. And he had stuff, he had articles in the Wall Street Journal within the last 10 years. And he was, in 2016, he was given a big award for his work. So that underlying view of eugenics that plays into the testing is definitely something that we really need to think about. And that's where we also need to develop the counter narratives. There's a really good book called IQ, the history of a failed idea, because people are still basing their views on their intelligence on those tests. So yeah, actually in this upcoming book, we're going to have a chapter on assessment, and I'm not exactly sure what we're going to include there. I've done a lot of work on formative assessment. As you know, I interviewed you as part of that work. But the performance assessments, the standardized testing are still kind of hanging out there. And you know, how could a kid not get stereotyped throughout when they get hammered into them this whole idea of an achievement gap? You know, that's a negative stereotype that on one hand, it was good for educators to become aware that they were failing students of color. On the other hand, this gap just got hammered into people's minds, and I'm sure it impacted generations of students and still does, as they feel like, oh, I come up from a group that must not be smart, no wonder, or I won't be, you know, that all that impacting them.
Yeah. So how do you advise administrators, teachers, parents in the educational arena to talk about the achievement gap or school to prison pipeline? Is there a different language you suggest they use, or they use it differently when talking with kids? What's your advice to school buildings, administrators, when having discussions around these topics and trying to refrain from using this somewhat possibly oppressive language?
Well, I think shifting from achievement gap to opportunity gap already shifts the way people look at it, because then it's not pointing the finger at the student for not achieving, it's pointing the finger at the system for not offering opportunities. I think the use of the term counter narrative is really important, and I don't know how widely it's being used, but the idea of that there are some very negative narratives out there, and we can provide alternative ways of looking at that. I think that the work on the growth mindset is extremely important because that is a counter narrative to the view of intelligence based on, an IQ test. It's the idea that students can learn that if you believe that your brain is growing and if you believe that you grow smarter by learning more, you will learn more. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Mary Murphy. She's at Indiana University, and she did this research with some others, and I can send it to you, on the impact of teacher attitudes with the growth mindset on students. And it has a tremendous impact. I don't have that figure in my head, on students of color. If the teacher has a growth mindset, they did it with like 15,000 college students. And that research, actually, it came out that it was more important for the teacher, the professor, to have that attitude than actually even the racial background of the educator, that in their study. So that says a lot. If a teacher and a professor can communicate this view and reach the students with the feeling that all you have to do is just keep learning and you're going to get smarter as you learn, that will do a lot to counteract some of the negative stereotypes out there.
Wow. I mean, I could go on another 30 minutes just having more questions come up. I appreciate you, Becki, coming on and really, again, giving folks a sense of who you are, what your work is about, and what you're doing day to day. And we'll definitely post and add some of the resources that you mentioned so that people can have that. I want to close out by asking you, you mentioned your blog, you mentioned your book, but what are you up? What else are you up to? What else do you foresee over this next decade, so to speak, for you and your work? What's on the horizon?
I think for me, if I can keep my focus on identity safety, that would be really good. I do have some other areas of interest. I've become very interested in family history, and I made a film. Well, I had a reunion with family members. My great-great-grandfather had 17 children, and a museum wanted to return items the Nazis had stolen from him. So I organized a reunion of family, and I met family I didn't know I had all over the world, the descendants of these 17 children. And the film is called Almost Lost, because we almost lost each other. So I've been doing some work with that, and I will continue to. I just finished a story about my mother's experience as she started, where they started having Hitler rallies in school. They'd take her out and put her in the office while the kids would be chanting with the Hitler Youth. And then eventually she was kicked out of school, and eventually they had to flee for their life. And I think that message is very important as we look at racism and bigotry here, that we can't just sit back and think, oh, things are better now, because they can get worse and worse very, very quickly. And we have to really call it, and we call it being an upstander every time we see racism and hate. And so I want to continue to do some of that work. I want to continue to do some writing. And I do give workshops and presentations. And with the cancer, I kind of slowed that down. And now, of course, it's halted. But I hope to build that back up. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. And I also applaud the work that you're doing. I've learned so much from that work. And like I said, I'm so honored to be part of the book that has done so well in educating teachers. And I look forward to seeing the one about the girls.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. We're going to end in a fun way. We like to ask people, we're trying to build a database of shows to watch, things that may teach you something, anything you've watched that you learned something from, or something that just took you away that you enjoyed, that gave you a chance to just unplug. Are there one or two shows you would recommend for the listening audience on your way out?
Okay. Well, I'm watching The Plot Against America, which is kind of an interesting series that shows what would have happened if Lindbergh had won the presidency and he was a fan of Hitler. and it's kind of haunting, and that's, a serious show that's very interesting. I also like Schitt's Creek, which is just a lighthearted, humorous thing that we watch every day. And then Better Call Saul, which I don't know how that counts. It's definitely a distraction. And that character who was plucked out of Breaking Bad is quite an entertaining character to watch. But there are a lot of really good ones out there, and I look forward to hearing what your other people. Are you going to publish the list? What everybody
Yeah, we're going to
said?
try to put something up there. One of the things I've heard from Kevin Jennings actually is a show that I watched recently called Unorthodox. I don't know if
Oh
you've seen
yeah,
this on Netflix or seen it, but
yeah.
I thought that was a really just well done, but also just had me thinking and reflecting kind of story that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, there's one other thing I want to mention is that on Passover, a bunch of celebrities and artists got together and did a Seder. It's called the Saturday Night Seder. And it was a fundraiser for the coronavirus, for the CDC. And it was a real Passover Seder. It's on YouTube. People can watch it on YouTube. And I cried through the whole thing because it kind of brought together a history for Jewish people. We've been celebrating the freedom from slavery for, millennia. And so that was the vertical. And then here were all these people in their rooms, in their homes. I don't know how they did an excellent editing job. There was beautiful music, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. There were people of all ethnic backgrounds and also different religions. But if you get a chance to look at it, it starts with Jason Alexander from Seinfeld. He leads it off, and it's humorous. It's a little sacrilegious, but it does capture the spirit of Passover, and it ends with this beautiful group of people saying where we hope to be in a year. And they also, because that's part of the services of next year, where do we want to be? So I recommend it.
Well, thank you for that as well. Listen, Becki, thank you. You're always welcome to the White Privilege Conference. We consider you family, so when you want to come and present and be a part of that, you just let me know. And I'll look forward to being in touch as you continue to do your great work. And if we can be, again, a supporter or collaborator in any way, let us know. Much love to you, sister. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.